panel at the 2020 think tank at the Conservative Party conference on UK free trade after Brexit, the United States and beyond. I'm Dr. Ted Broman, the chair of the panel. I'm the senior research fellow in Anglo-American relations in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation, in case we're new to you, is a proudly conservative think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C. Founded in 1973, we lead the fight for conservative solutions to foreign and domestic policy problems. All of our work is available free of charge on our website at www.heritage.org. The Heritage Foundation has been participating in the Conservative Party conference since 2014, sponsoring panels and participating in events that promote Lady Thatcher's vision of strong Anglo-American relations, free trade, and democratic solidarity against tyranny. Heritage has been the leading voice in Washington in favor of Brexit. Broadly speaking, we back Brexit because we believe in national sovereignty and thus British independence from the EU. But we also believe in the material benefits that will flow from Brexit. We were the first US think tank to publish a paper backing a UK-US free trade area, and we continue to work to achieve that goal. Some of our latest research on a UK-US FTA is easily available on the click-through page for this panel. Just over a year ago, we were honored to host today's headline speaker at the Heritage Foundation when she set out the vision of the British government for a US-UK FTA. Today, we return to that topic and to the wider issue of UK trade policy after Brexit. The British government under Prime Minister Johnson has made clear its commitment to free trade, and over the past several months, it's taken impressive steps to make that commitment into a reality. From an FTA with Japan to advanced negotiations with the US, the UK is returning to the world stage as an independent trading nation. Today, we'll look at the UK's commitment to free trade with the US and beyond. Joining us today are three distinguished speakers. Speaking first, the Right Honorable Liz Truss, MP, Secretary of State for International Trade and President of the Board of Trade, and Minister for Women and Equalities. Speaking second, Dan Hannan, UK Trade Advisor, President of the Initiative for Free Trade, and visiting professor at the University of Francisco Marroquin. Finally, speaking third, Shanker SIngham, CEO of the Competare Group, Chairman of Global Vision UK, a former cleared advisor to the USTR and the UK Trade Secretary, and Chairman of GEN, the Global Economic Neural Networks. I should note that due to a last-minute change in his plane schedule, Dan Hannon will present his remarks in recorded form and will unfortunately not be available to take questions. But please submit your questions to me and I'll direct them to the speakers who will present live. With that, I'll invite the Right Honorable Liz Truss, the Secretary of State for International Trade, to open this panel with her remarks. Secretary of State.
Well, thank you very much, Ted. And first of all, can I give my best wishes to President Trump and the First Lady and wish them both a speedy recovery from coronavirus. Our relationship with the United States is incredibly important. The US is our largest single country trading partner. Of course, they are our key ally, believers in democracy, free enterprise, and free trade. And I believe that the US free trade agreement with the United Kingdom is an opportunity to turbocharge that relationship and bring huge economic benefits to both our countries. Our estimate, which we are currently reviewing to make sure it fully covers areas like data and digital, is that it will boost trade by at least £15 billion, bringing the biggest benefits to parts of our country like Scotland and the Midlands. But I also believe that this trade deal will be of huge benefit to the United States. When we succeed in striking this comprehensive deal, we will be the largest economy that the US has a comprehensive trade deal with. And I think that prize should not be underestimated. And together with our aspiration to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what this will mean is key countries that believe in high standards, that believe in free trade and believe in following the rules will have a strong counterpoint to force the WTO to change its ways and reform. And that is why I believe this is important, both geopolitically as well as economically, for the United Kingdom and the United States. We need to work with like-minded allies. We need to challenge some of the behavior, whether it's forced technology transfer, IP theft, subsidies by state-owned industries. But as the United Kingdom, we also need to make sure that we're hitching our business and our industry and our growth opportunities to fast-growing parts of the world, like the Americas and like the Pacific. And as we seek to recover from the COVID crisis, we need economic growth. And as we see depressed demand domestically, that means the UK getting a larger share of the global pie, which means better and more trade deals. I also think it's a way of the United Kingdom moving out of the EU regulatory orbit. The fact is the EU is an outlier in terms of their approach to trade. They are protectionist in areas like digital and areas like services. And that has harmed the United Kingdom because we're the second largest exporter of services in the world, and we have big opportunities. This trade agenda, the UK becoming the centre of a hub of global trade deals, means that we can move out of that slow lane, especially in digital and services. And just because we've got our own independent regulatory policy doesn't mean that we're automatically going to sign up with what the US asks, or indeed what other trading partners ask. It means we're sovereign and we make our own decisions, but I think those decisions can be more flexible and they can be more open. And we've already given a good example of that in the Japan trade deal that we've struck. The Japan trade deal goes further in data and digital than the EU will sign up to in terms of free flow of data, anti-data localization, protection of source code, net neutrality. All of those areas are covered, which will bring huge benefits to the UK tech and services industry. We've also underwritten our financial services chapter with data and digital provisions in areas like mobility, in areas like rules of origin. We've been able to go further than the EU, and we've also got additional protections for our creative industry. So I think this shows the direction that we can go in as an independent trading nation, particularly going further in areas like digital data and services, where the UK has a comparative advantage. And we want to work with like-minded allies like the Americans, like the Japanese, like the Australians, to help shape the global rules on the basis of free market democracies. I think it's very important. So what could the US deal contain? Well, first of all, I think digital data, services, mobility are all very important parts of the deal. I also think we can bring big benefits to our manufacturing industries in both countries, reducing unnecessary tariffs, making our testing regime similar. So if you look at, for example, ceramics, there's currently a 28% tariffs on dinner plates. Those are the type of exports that we could help unleash through a trade deal. We can also help small and medium-sized enterprises by cutting red tape on customs, making it easier for them to sell into each other's markets. And I think there are huge benefits for British agriculture as well. This week, we saw the first shipment of UK beef going to the US for 24 years, going from Northern Ireland to Philadelphia. There's huge demand for high-quality British produce. That's estimated to be worth £66 million to British farmers over the next 5 years. And I want to see the ban on British lamb removed, giving our lamb farmers an alternative market apart from the European Union. We also want to get the tariffs removed on our whiskey, currently 25% in retaliation for Airbus. So there are lots of benefits for British business. And of course, I want to make sure our farmers benefit out of a trade deal. We'll be using all the techniques that we use in any trade deal to make sure that our farmers continue to be able to compete and continue to be able to maintain their high standards. So in terms of the process we're going through, we started negotiations on the 5th of May. We've just finished round 5 of negotiations. Both sides have laid all of the text for all of the chapters, and we're now in a position of consolidating the text so that we have a strong foundation to build our agreement on. We're also negotiating the market access, so that's the tariffs and the quotas and all the details there as well. So we really have made significant progress. We're going to carry on working right up to the US presidential elections. The next round finishes on the 30th of October. So we really are not letting grass grow under our feet, and we are making significant progress. We're working with both the Republican administration, but also Democrats on the Hill to make sure there's cross-party support for our agreement, because my fundamental view is that this agreement is good for both the United States and the United Kingdom, but it's also good for the causes of democracy, free enterprise, and free trade across the world. And that's why we should all support it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll now hear Dan Hannon's remarks in recorded form.
Hi folks, this is Daniel Hannan, member of the Board of Trade, President of the Initiative for Free Trade. It's a huge pleasure to be here, albeit remotely, because I really wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you to the Secretary of State and how lucky we are to have somebody who is serious about restoring the United Kingdom as a great global trader. Free trade is in many ways counterintuitive. The assertions on which protectionism and mercantilism rest sound perfectly plausible. They turn out to be specious, but they all sound like common sense. We can't carry on with a big trade deficit. We can't compete with countries that pay slave wages. We need to protect our strategic industries. We need to grow more of our own food. All of those assertions sound reasonable, but all of them, when turned into policy, serve to make a country poorer. Here's the problem that we have as we excitingly take back control of our trade policy after the better part of half a century. We've fallen out of practice. And so a lot of those old false protectionist nostrums have come back, especially because of the psychological changes, if you like, the wariness induced by the coronavirus and its accompanying closures. I've lost count of how many previously reliable free marketeers have said to me over the past 6 months, surely, Hannon, even you now must accept that we need to produce more of our food in this country. The virus has shown how important it is to be able to be self-reliant. Really? I mean, sure, that's our hunch, right? That's our intuition. That's our inner caveman speaking. Those are the instincts that a million years of evolution have inculcated in us, wanting to hoard food, wanting to be able to see your own stash. But ask the question logically, has anything happened as a result of the epidemic and the consequent lockdowns that strengthen the case for protectionism? Surely, if anything, the opposite is true. We've learned the extraordinary importance of imports. We've learned how critical it is to be able to source what you need from a wide variety of suppliers. As it happened, the coronavirus hit in late March, and the worst of our closures lasted through April and into early May. Now, the farmers watching will know that that is the period which in the United Kingdom is called the hungry gap. It's the time when we don't really produce much food of our own. We've come to the end of the winter crops. There are no more potatoes or cabbages or turnips. We haven't yet reached the first harvests. So if we hadn't been able to import what we needed, we would have been living on rhubarb and asparagus, maybe some purple sprouting broccoli, and perhaps a little bit of nettle soup, right? But that didn't happen because even though there was a global simultaneous shock, markets continued to function. And what was true for food was true for every other supposed strategic resource. I mean, the idea that any country is going to sit on every possible ingredient for a vaccine for every possible future virus and on every kind of medical kit and all the rest of it, just on the off chance that that particular kind of virus will come along, is absurd. You could fill the whole country with storage and still not be prepared for the next mutation or the next bug. Right? The way in which you have security is to be able to get what you need without restrictions and without barriers. I know this sounds counterintuitive to a lot of people. I know it doesn't make sense because we have these instincts and intuitions honed on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. But here's one way of thinking of it. Think about those policies taken to their logical extremes. There's one country in the world that more than any other elevates the ideology of self-sufficiency. And that's North Korea. Juche, it's called in Korea. Self-reliance, import substitution, make everything yourself, don't depend on foreigners for anything. Okay? And at the other end of that spectrum, the country most unlike North Korea in terms of trade policy is Singapore. Singapore barely produces an edible ounce. It is utterly dependent not only on imported food, but on imported electricity, imported water. Where would you rather live? North Korea, the place that has elevated self-sufficiency, is the last place on the planet where we still have man-made famines. Famines caused not by some natural disaster, but purely by policy. Singapore, by contrast, has the cheapest and most secure food supplies in the world. Why? Because the truth is that food security, like security in any other resource, does not depend on domestic supply. It depends on having a broad range of options. If you want to diversify away from over-reliance on one supplier, there's no point in just reshoring everything, because you will still be just as subject to a local shock or a particular disruption in your own country as the country from which you were previously importing would have been, right? The way genuinely to be secure is to have lots of different suppliers. Now, we need to win that argument in this country, because forming against us is a coalition of all sorts of people who don't like trade, don't like capitalism, don't like America, or certainly don't like Trump's America, don't like meat, don't like the modern market economy. And then added to them, of course, are lots of perfectly well-meaning people, genuinely good, sincere, moderate people, altruistic people who think that they're doing their bit, to reduce food miles or improve the environment or support our farmers or whatever it is. Now, here's the thing. What's the best way of supporting our farmers? I'm speaking to you from a very rural part of the country. What's the best way to support our farmers? The best way to support our farmers is to give them the opportunity to compete. We have some of the most innovative, inventive producers anywhere on the planet. And as we leave the Common Agricultural Policy, they will have new opportunities to do things which the occasionally technophobic and Luddite European Commission was reluctant to permit. We've now seen the beginnings of new markets opening up for our agri-foods business. We're selling our Stilton in Japan, we're selling our beef in the United States, and the lamb market that could follow there is huge. We should be confident. We shouldn't be hiding behind tariffs or non-tariff barriers. And when I hear people who know better pretending to be upset about beef hormones, used, by the way, not just in the United States, but everywhere else, in Australia and Argentina, everywhere outside Europe. When I hear people using what they know to be bogus and unscientific arguments, the beef ban in the EU not only flies in the face of WTO rulings and WHO assessments, but defies even the EU's own scientific advisory bodies. When I see people who I know have tucked in perfectly happily to steaks or burgers whenever they've been stateside, and then come back here and almost sneeringly play on the imagined fears of people who they think are a bit dimmer than they are, I see people who are doing this country, and not least our agri-food sector, no favours at all. We need to win those arguments in a very unpropitious time. It's difficult to win this case even in normal times, but in the aftermath of the coronavirus, we are struggling with additional handicaps. But the proof will come with success. As we get these deals done, first with the US, then Australia and New Zealand and Japan, then joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then the many others that will follow, opening this country's market so that we can buy the best stuff at the best price from around the world, so that our manufacturers can have cheaper components, so that we can free up all of that extra time and money and disposable income to drive innovation and productivity in our own country. We will be rediscovering the formula that first raised us above the run of nations. From the 1840s onwards, we became the first free trading nation in the world. We'd invented the theory, first with the writings of Adam Smith and then of David Ricardo, and then after the repeal of the Corn Laws, we began to apply it. And what happened? Prices fell, which meant that people suddenly had more take-home pay, they had more leisure hours, and it meant that they could produce and consume more, which meant that we stimulated domestic industry, and we became the richest country on earth. And if you look at the journals and the letters of almost any visitor from overseas to Victorian Britain, the thing that struck all of them was that here, for the first time, was a tangible increase in living standards for ordinary people. For the first time ever, the mass of the population could afford luxuries, could afford more than one suit of clothes and glass windows and porcelain and watches and things that previously had been the preserve of the rich. Of course, other countries then started copying us. They started catching up, which was great, right? I mean, we want to have rich neighbours. We want everyone else to be catching up and being as rich as us. We hope that a free trading Britain will not only raise living standards here at home, but will inspire other countries and help to re-energize a stalled WTO system. But all of these things depend on our having the courage, having the faith in our own capacity to go out and liberalize, to strike these trade deals, and to recognize the fundamental truth that protectionism is a way of taxing the poor in order to favor vested interests. Nothing could be further from the truth than the idea that free trade is some kind of corporatist ramp, that it's somehow in the interests of big multinationals. The opposite is true. Nobody lobbies harder for distortions and anti-trade barriers than the big corporates, because they know how to game that system. And nobody stands to gain more from the removal of those barriers than people on low incomes. We were the country that made it happen the first time around. Let's make it happen again. Thank you to Liz. Thank you to all of you being here. Thank you to Ted, who has been working so hard on ensuring that we have a world-beating, cutting-edge US-UK free trade agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, the best is yet to come.
Thanks very much to Dan Hannan for those remarks. I'll now invite Shanker SIngham to wrap up the panel and remind the audience that you're welcome to submit questions, which I'll direct to our speakers. Shanker, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted. Thank you to the TPA and to the IEA and to the Secretary of State and Dan for their remarks. I'd say a couple of things. First of all, it's a privilege to do this event at Think Tent, because we launched a sort of blueprint for UK trade policy back in April 2017 and discussed our IEA launch of Plan A Plus at this very event 2 years ago. So it's quite an interesting time to sort of reflect back on the previous 2 years and see how far we have come. I've outlined a sort of four-pillared trade policy approach in the past, and it's quite useful to sort of do a scorecard of those four pillars and see how we're doing. So if you look at the unilateral pillar, which I've talked about, DIT has now come out with the UK Global Tariff, which will apply from January of next year. That in many ways is a much more liberal trading regime than the common external tariff of the EU. It contains a number of key elements like lowering tariffs for input tariffs in certain areas, simplification of the schedules and so forth. But it doesn't entirely get you to sort of unilateral free trade. It preserves the ability for the UK to negotiate better solutions, which is important because the UK is a demandeur for things like services and data and digital and some of the things that the Secretary of State talked about. And we actually do need, in the realpolitik world of trade policy, we do need some leverage in order to achieve those goals. I think in terms of domestic regulation and our own domestic regulatory settings, that is where I think we need to do a bit more work. The UK's domestic regulatory settings, in other words, how competitive, how pro-competitive our domestic regulations are, very much will set our external trade policy, or if they are closed or they're more protectionist, if you will, they will limit the UK's ability to have a successful external trade policy, and it will limit the ability for the UK to fully embrace the global Britain that the Prime Minister talked about in his excellent Greenwich speech. So, and I think in that area, more work needs to be done by the UK government to promote a pro-competitive regulatory environment in the UK. Bilaterally, obviously, we're talking a lot today about the US agreement. Putting the US agreement in the context, the wider context of all of the UK trade policy, it is a pivotal agreement. It's pivotal for many of the reasons that the Secretary of State mentioned: common alignment around free trade, pro-competitive markets, property rights protection, all of these things. But it's also pivotal in the way the world thinks about trade policy. You have two competing models. It's often said you've got the EU model, the China model, the US model. That's not entirely correct. What you actually have is two competing models, really. One is based on regulatory harmonization. We're going to make you, our trading partner, adopt our regulatory system. And that is something that is being embraced by the EU, and it's being embraced by China. The other model, which is embraced by the CPTPP countries and by the US, and I hope by the UK going forward, is one of trade based on regulatory competition, based on equivalence, mutual recognition. In other words, as long as we have the same regulatory goals, we should recognize our regulations as much as we can, provided our regulatory systems objectively achieve those regulatory goals. And that's why the US agreement is so important, because it will very much shift the UK out of the EU's regulatory orbit, as the Secretary of State said, and into not the US's orbit, but into the orbit of countries that believe that it's through recognition and equivalence and adequacy arrangements that we are going to promote trade. Why is that important? Because it's quite unlikely for a harmonized regulatory system to deliver pro-competitive, consumer welfare enhancing economic growth. It's much more likely that a competitive system where people are experimenting with the best kinds of regulation to achieve those regulatory goals, much more likely that will achieve the goal. So the US agreement is incredibly important on that score. And one would hope that the kinds of things we've seen in the Japan agreement in terms of data and digital and financial services would be taken even further forward with the US agreement. And we could really come to an agreement with the US which is significantly different from the agreement that or the level of ambition the US and the EU have with respect to each other, because the UK doesn't have the same sort of baggage that the EU does that would hold back those kinds of things. And so the goal of the US agreement is, I think, from a geopolitical, geostrategic standpoint, is really two things. One, to create a transatlantic area underpinned by pro-competitive regulatory frameworks and property rights protection and open trade, and also to set the table for the global trading system. And it's a vital axis there. The other bits of the bilateral agenda, obviously the EU agreement, I'm not going to say a lot about it on this panel, but I think we've made tremendous progress there. We're now embracing a free trade agreement with the EU. No longer can our trading allies say, we need to wait to see what your agreement will be with the EU before we negotiate with you, because we are just like everybody else now. We're negotiating an FTA with the EU, and it will be an FTA based on the independence of our regulatory choices, which is crucial for our trading partners. We mentioned the Japan agreement. It was a bit of a bonus from my perspective, because I didn't sort of talk a lot about that in our previous work. But one thing I would say about the Japan agreement is that the DIT is to be commended for the speed with which this agreement was put together. We recall all those people who said, oh, the UK can't possibly negotiate these agreements in time. It'll take 7 years to do an FTA. Well, lo and behold, the UK has done a deal with Japan, fastest FTA, frankly, I think possibly ever. And it shows what you can do if you actually have focused offensive interests, which the UK does, and limited defensive concerns, or certainly more limited than, say, the EU. If the UK can position itself not to be a mini version of the EU, but to actually have some domestic regulatory flexibility and open domestic settings, then the model that we saw with Japan is the model that we can adopt with a lot of different trading partners. Plurilaterally, we talked about the CPTPP and accession to that. That has moved on in leaps and bounds in the last 2 years. We've got support from Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, now Vietnam, as a result of Dominic Raab's most recent visit there. Vietnam is supporting the UK, and I think that these countries are supporting the UK's accession because they see a major G7 nation adopting independent trade policy for the first time in 40 plus years, able to have a different approach than the EU. And therefore, when you look at the G7 and you look at the direction of travel of France and Germany and China and so forth, you don't see a lot of positive stories from that perspective. The UK is the positive story. That's why it's so sought out by these countries. And then finally, WTO multilateral agenda. We always wanted leadership in the WTO. We actually now have a candidate for Director General of the WTO who made it through the first round. And there is a need in the WTO for political heft. The problems of the WTO are not technical in nature, they are political, and you need somebody who's going to be able to face a Donald Trump, a Xi, a Narendra Modi, when they are experiencing enormous protection pressures their publics. You need somebody who can can get in the room with them. And more importantly than the character of the person of the Director General, the UK can take trade leadership by proposing things that build on the existing trade agenda and unlocking problems that have existed in trade policy, particularly in things like services, in digital, in data, and yes, even in agriculture, if we can find some solutions and find ways of balancing, our need to protect UK farmers with our need to open up markets around the world. And then the final thing I'd say in my comments is the one thing we didn't predict 2 years ago, of course, was COVID, and we need to come out of the economic crisis that we have, in some respects, created for ourselves. In some respects, the virus has created. And the only way we're going to do that, because governments are going to be substantially indebted when we do come out of this, the only way we're going to come out of this is through private sector economic growth and through wealth creation. And that's only going to happen if we have open trading systems, if we get more trade, so we correct the decline of trade as a percentage of global GDP, and that we have regulatory systems around the world that promote pro-competitive growth and entrepreneurial spirit. One thing pandemics do is they accelerate pre-existing trends. So there was a trend beforehand for more resilient global supply chains. There was a trend beforehand towards nodes and networks. This is the work I've done for the Global Economic Neural Networks, the GEN group. GEN produced a report very recently where we talked about what we need to do. And what we need to do is open up business travel and business routes with key markets, and not to close them in the way that we have been doing. We need to have supply chains where we have a bit more visibility, and we need to embrace concepts like the UK's idea of free ports and free zones, because that is the way that at a sub-national level you can experiment with some of these regulatory framework improvements and regulatory sandboxes to make the domestic regulatory system much more competitive. So I think overall, I would say that while COVID has sort of thrown a bit of a curveball at all of us, it also allows those countries that are going to embrace those kinds of private sector economic growth policies to move large amounts of the global capital supply chain into their countries. And what the UK will want to do is take a disproportionate amount of that global capital, which is extremely mobile. In terms of the UK's trade policy, I think if I were to sort of score this over the last 2 years, it's there's a lot of flashing green lights in all of those all of those 4 pillars. The UK, I think, has made extremely good progress on all of them. The only concern I would have is the debate that we're of necessity having in the UK now, which is what is our domestic regulatory setting? Are we going to be pro-competitive, or are we going to be a sort of mini version of the EU? And that question is incredibly important to answer, because if we can answer it in a positive way, being more pro-competitive, being more based on regulatory recognition and equivalence as opposed to harmonisation, then the future for global Britain is extremely bright. But if we're not able to answer that in a positive way, that is going to limit our ability to deliver global Britain and all the economic growth that will go with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shanker. I just wanted to underline and emphasize a remark that you made in the course of your comments there, that it's very easy, and of course it's important, to look at the details of trade agreements, to look at tariffs and quotas and rules and ideas about equivalence. But I don't think we should lose track of the fact that Britain joining as an independent trading nation the world's economic and trading system is an event of enormous magnitude. You just don't get a new G7 economy joining the world's trading system as an independent nation every day. It doesn't happen for most people once in their lifetime. It doesn't happen once in 100 years in most cases. So, people like the Secretary of State, people like Shanker, people like Dan are rightly going to have to concern themselves with all of the details of these ferociously complicated negotiations. But behind all of that, I think that people who are listening to this panel and wider publics should bear in mind that this is an event of world historic importance for the international trading system. And it really is up to Britain, with Britain's negotiating partners, of course, to make the most of it. And that's the spirit that I hope the British government, and I believe the British government, is approaching all of these trade negotiations. With that, let me turn to audience questions. I'll direct this question first to the Secretary of State, but Shanker, you probably will want to chime in on this as well. Sarah from the audience asks, quote, what are the red lines in any trade deal between the UK and the US? What standards, if any, is the UK willing to lower to secure a trade deal with the US? Secretary of State?
Well, thank you. First of all, I should make it clear we published our negotiating objectives, so we very clearly laid out what the UK wants from the deal and what our red lines are. Those include protecting the National Health Service, making sure that drugs prices in the National Health Service don't rise, and also maintaining our standards, not lowering them in terms of food. It's important to note that our food standards are revised by the Food Standards Agency. That's a body independent of government that reports directly to Parliament. So they are responsible for advising on those standards. To the broader point about regulation that Shanker has just been talking about, I think there are two different issues here. There is what is the UK's domestic regulatory settings? And I'm very clear that as we leave the EU, we've got the opportunity to do things differently. I've highlighted the area of data and digital, where we've just signed up to an agreement with Japan, where we go much further and we're much less protectionist than the EU is in similar agreements in areas like free flow of data, anti-data localization. And of course, in all of the areas that we work in, whether it's agriculture or industrial standards, over time, the UK will be making sure that our regulations reflect the interests and values of Britain, and we adjust them in that way. So, for example, in agriculture, we're dumping things like the 3-crop rule, which didn't deliver any value but tied up farmers in red tape. So there is an important discussion, as Shanker talked about, of the evolution of our domestic standards. And I'm very pleased that Shanker agreed to serve on the Trade and Agriculture Commission, which is looking at some of those issues in the trade context. So, Shanker, the future is in your hands, along with your colleagues on the Trade and Agriculture Commission, on those particular issues. But I think it's also important to note that alongside our domestic settings, there's how do we deal with other countries? And as Shanker points out, the EU tend to demand that other countries follow exactly the way they do things. And I don't think that is a helpful approach. What we want is to be able to allow different models to coexist around the world, to be able to work with partners, even though they don't have exactly the same domestic regulations. So I'm in favor of a flexible approach of looking at what we do on a case-by-case basis and working with like-minded allies to help shape the global trading system. Because what we've got at the moment in the World Trade Organization is deliberate flouting of some of the core rules of trade. And I think it's important to have high standards, but I don't think that means that everybody has to be exactly the same and everybody has to have exactly the same domestic regulations. So we're going to have a British-shaped domestic regulatory system that reflects our values, our standards, and the way we want to operate. But we are going to work hard with partners to have a flexible approach so that we can trade whilst not imposing our precise regulations on those other partners, as I think in the past the EU have sought to do.
Thanks very much, Secretary. Shanker, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, let me pick up one. I think it's become a bit of a straw man argument on regulation and standards, which is the notion that more regulation or less regulation is either better or worse, depending on your sort of political starting point. I think the reality is that what we want pro-competitive regulation. So the benchmark that you use to decide that is, and it's a benchmark that exists in the WTO system and exists in the OECD frameworks for these things, is that you generally want regulation that is the least trade distortive, the most competition enhancing that you can get consistent with a legitimate regulatory goal. Those are a balance that is quite hard to strike, but that's what we're really trying to do. And you judge regulation by how close it gets to achieving that objective, not by whether there's more of it or less of it or whatever. So I don't think this issue of if the UK were to change a regulation or change a standard, that does not automatically mean you're lowering a standard. In many ways, it may mean that you're making the standard more consistent with the legitimate regulatory objective. I would also point out with the US deal, it's the US is negotiating objectives that say that the UK is not to lower its labour or environmental standards to seek trade advantage, which is, increasingly becoming a fairly common theme in trade agreements. So there seems to be this assumption that the US is going to demand that the UK will lower its labour and environmental standards. Quite the reverse, quite the contrary. The US in its negotiating objectives has said that the UK mustn't do those things. So I don't think there's any risk of this from the US side. But I think the issue of red lines and what we need to do in order to get a deal is quite a mercantilist way of thinking about a trade agreement. I mean, what you actually want from a trade agreement, the purpose of a trade agreement, yes, we all talk about market access and we all talk about our exporters getting better access to those markets, and that is important. But it's import competition that's actually the real value of a trade agreement, because what that does is it lowers price, it increases choice, it generates economic activity, it generates growth, which is what we desperately need at the moment. And that's what you'll see if you can create a genuinely transatlantic area for some of these sectors, so that you get more efficiencies, you get more wealth creation, and you ultimately get more jobs.
Thanks, Shanker. I always yield to your expertise on trade issues, but I was once told that if you begin thinking about trade always from the perspective of the consumer first, not the producer, you can never go too terribly far wrong. And that's something that I think we should all bear in mind when we talk about a UK-US deal or any other trade deal. How will it benefit the consumer first and producing interests second? Let me ask a question which, just for the sake of variety, I'll direct to Shanker first, and then the Secretary of State can follow up. The next question is from Felix, who asks, quote, given Trump's apparent hostility to the CPTPP, Shanker, you might explain what that acronym stands for, the Pacific Trade Agreement, should free traders be hoping for a Biden victory in the US election?
See why you asked me first. The First of all, the CPTPP is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this is the original, or originally this was the TPP. And why the TPP is important is it was originally conceived really by Sir Lockwood Smith when he was Trade Minister in New Zealand, and the Singaporean Trade Minister. They essentially recognised that the global trading system, the WTO system, was basically in stasis. It made no progress, and in the sort of mid 2000s. This idea of a comprehensive agreement that built on what the WTO was able to do, and advanced and challenged the WTO to actually do more, was something that was important. And when the US came into the TPP, it actually drove a lot of the language and a lot of the agreement, a lot of the CPTPP, even though the US is no longer a part of it. A lot of that language was really put there by the US. So it is a very important agreement for the US. I think a Biden administration, may be more open to the US going back into CPTPP. It was the Trump administration, of course, that pulled the US out of it. However, I would caution free traders sort of pinning their hopes on a Biden victory. I think, first of all, I would say that, and I don't think this is a controversial point, the Joe Biden of 2020 is not the Joe Biden of 2008. Of the Obama Biden administration. The Democrat Party, frankly, is not the Democrat Party of 2008. Still less the party of Bill Clinton on trade. I don't think a Biden administration would really entertain any significant trade policy progress. They would probably be even more hawkish than Trump is on China. The one area, ironically, that might survive a Biden trade policy, because you can't say no to everything. You have to have something that you can support, and the business community will not want to see a completely negative trade policy, and they will have some sway, not a lot of sway in a Biden administration, but some. And the Democrats will be looking for, if they're going to do any kind of trade deal at all, it will be with a country where there's no race to the bottom on labor, on environment. There's no offshoring of US jobs, all of those things. And there's really only one trade negotiation the US has going on right now that checks all those boxes, and that is the UK deal. So, I would say that. I would also have a note of caution here about TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority. A Biden administration will be pushed very hard, and the Democrats may after this election control all branches of government. I mean, not all branches of government. Certainly, the House and the Senate and the executive potentially could win the Senate. If that were to occur, there will be tremendous pressure on a Biden administration to inject all kinds of things into that TPA, if indeed he's allowed to have TPA at all. That would be very counterproductive, I think, to everything that we've been talking about here. So I certainly don't think free traders should be hoping for a Biden win, I don't think free traders should be banking on a Biden win to solve some of the issues in global trade. I think instead, what people who are on the free trade side of the equation need to do is think about how do you actually solve the China trade problem. In other words, a major market that distorts its market in all kinds of anti-competitive ways, violates basic trade rules all over the place. How do you actually deal with that with a positive offensive and defensive agenda that involves, to some degree, tarificating those distortions, but does not involve a sledgehammer tariff that will basically cut off all trade from China? How do we send a signal to the Chinese government that we are open for the imports from their competitive companies, but we are going to do serious things about their systematic distortion of markets and reducing costs of Chinese SOEs and other companies? That's the challenge. I don't think Biden has a better answer than Trump on that. But I think it's incumbent on us to figure out what the answer is, because if we don't come with an answer to that question, we are going to be mired in this problem for years or decades to come.
Secretary of State, I'll give you an opportunity to weigh in on this question if you care to do so.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think that Shanker talked about the idea of a transatlantic free trade area. I think we can have both a transatlantic and a trans-Pacific trade area. That's what is exciting about where the UK is situated now. And in fact, a lot of the building blocks that are required to do a deal with the US are quite similar to the building blocks required to accede to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So as far as I'm concerned, there's no wasted effort in pursuing both of these options at the same time. And indeed, if the US at some point were to decide to join TPP, the UK would be very well placed. So the work that we're doing, both with the US and with our proposed accession and negotiations and working that we're currently conducting on TPP, are, in my view, building up those blocks that will form our future accession and help create this group of countries, this group of trade agreements, which can essentially challenge the inaction that we've seen at the WTO. So it's important for both hitching Britain to fast-growing areas of the world, but it's also important for challenging the types of practice that Shanker has just referred to in those talks. And what I'm in it for as Trade Secretary is for the United Kingdom to have the most options we can have, because that puts us in the strongest possible position vis-a-vis our negotiating partners. And that also applies to the negotiations that we're currently conducting with the European Union as well. I mean, in terms of the race for the White House, it's always very dangerous for a foreign government to say which party we'd like in. We've made very good progress with Ambassador Lighthizer in the negotiations so far. As I said, we're working right up to the election. We are making as much progress as we can. So the US-UK trade deal is as ready to go as possible for whichever administration is in the White House. I think it's a positive proposition for both the US and the UK that any president would want to sign up to. And I also speak to senior Democrats as well, who are similarly supportive, particularly in areas like digital and data and services, where I think there's so much more to be done between the United States and the United Kingdom.
Thank you. I would just add, for my part, that the U.S. has free trade agreements with countries as diverse as Jordan, South Korea, Colombia, and I mean no disrespect to any of these trading partners when I say that the goal of a UK-US FTA is more important than any of those other FTAs. And the
And if I could just step in there, Ted, as far as I understand it, the United States has not signed a comprehensive trade deal with as large an economy as the United Kingdom.
Correct. And that's one reason why it's such an enormous opportunity for us. But I would point out that we've done these as the United States, we've done trade agreements with many other countries. Why don't we have an FTA with the UK already? It's not because of British ill will, and it's not because of lack of American goodwill. The reason there isn't a UK FTA right now is because the UK was, for over 40 years, a member of the European Union. Really as simple as that.
Mm.
So, leaving politics aside, and I think Felix asks an important question, but leaving politics aside, I view a UK-US FTA in the long run as an inevitability. Because now that the UK is out of the European Union, why is it not going to ultimately conclude an FTA with the United States and a great many other countries around the world? Leaving aside politics, I think that is the inevitable outcome. We have time for one very quick fire question. I'll ask both the Secretary of State and Shanker to weigh in on this. 60 seconds each, strict rule. Becky asks, as the UK is now striking its own trade deals, how do we gear up businesses to realize these new opportunities? Secretary of State?
Well, this is, of course, the crucial point, because as Trade Secretary, I can do the deals, but I can open the door, but it requires businesses to walk through that door. So what we will be doing is launching small and medium-sized enterprise chapters to get the businesses directly talking to each other in country. We'll be launching trade missions to back that up. But it really does require British business to get involved. So we've got lots of advisory group, got lots of engagement, but I would strongly encourage people to get in touch with the Department of International Trade about how indeed they can realise those opportunities.
Shanker, very quickly.
Yeah, I think for businesses and for countries for that matter, this is a massive global event, as you alluded to, Ted. Things are not going to stay the same. What business needs to do is have a sort of paradigm shift in the way it thinks about the way it markets its products and services around the world. But this is a massive paradigm shifting event. Supply chains are going to change. It is not going to be as it was in the past, where your market may have been primarily EU members because you're part of a single market and a customs union. But we need to understand that the single market and customs union membership of the UK, of the EU, distorted to some extent supply chains that would have been different otherwise, and that's what we're going to be moving to. So business needs to not just recognize, yes, there's a few market access opportunities in the US or Japan or other places, but that the fundamental structure, the trade policy structure of the world is changing, and in that change, entrepreneurial businesses thrive. They thrive on change. Things are always changing, and so businesses need to sort of say, where is our advantage? And I think the question that business needs to ask itself is, what do I want the world to look like in terms of trade and economic and regulatory policy? What generates the most economic activity?
Thank you very much, Shanker. I think, unfortunately, we have to wrap it up there. Let me first of all thank the Secretary of State for her participation today. I also want to, of course, thank Dan Hannon, Shanker SIngham for their participation today. I want to thank the IEA and the TPA for their wonderful organization and hosting of this virtual event. Let's all hope we can do it in physical form next year. Knock on wood for that. I've been asked to announce that tomorrow the TPA and the IEA will have an event straight after the Chancellor's speech at 1 p.m. on fiscal policy, tax and spend, and how to repair public finances after coronavirus. And there'll be another event on free speech at 2:30 p.m. tomorrow with Toby Young and Lawrence Fox. You can watch via the Think Tank YouTube channel or at www.thinktank.co.uk. Once again, thanks to all of our panelists and organizers, and I wish you a very pleasant virtual conference and success to the UK-US negotiations going forward. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.